Hi, my name is Dr. Amanda Child. I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist at UTHealth in the Government Medical School. And for those who aren't familiar with neuropsychology, what I do is I work with children with neurological conditions, assessing their cognitive functioning. So not only looking at their overall cognitive functioning or IQ, but also assessing skills that can be vulnerable to different neurological conditions like memory and attention and other skills that can be impacted by cognitive deficits like emotional and behavioral functioning, academic functioning. So today what I'm going to be talking with you about is the cognitive effects of childhood epilepsy. So in general, I wanted to give an overall sense of how epilepsy can impact cognitive functioning. And in short, epilepsy can have a huge range of outcomes on cognitive functioning. As you can see in this chart, this is a chart of average IQ scores for children with epilepsy. And here in orange, you can see that a lot of children with epilepsy actually have average or above IQ. So an estimate of their overall cognitive functioning is right where we want it to be, or even better for a lot of kids with epilepsy. That being said, though, there is a significant minority of kids with epilepsy who have an IQ that is below where we would expect for someone with age, more than what we would expect for children without epilepsy. So what that tells us is that while a lot of kids with epilepsy do pretty well cognitively, they are at risk for overall cognitive problems. So again, big range of outcomes, and there's no set recipe of what to expect cognitively in children with epilepsy. If you were to come up to me and tell me, hey, my child has this syndrome and this many seizures per week, and they're on this medication, I could make a guess as to how they're doing cognitively, but I certainly couldn't predict it with any level of accuracy. There's a really wide range, but what we can talk about today are cognitive skills that are vulnerable to epilepsy, what you can look out for at home and at school, what factors raise the risk of your child having cognitive difficulties, just so you're kind of aware, and what to do if you notice any difficulties in your child. What are some good next steps? So why do we see cognitive problems in children with epilepsy? So in a perfect world, the brain is really a giant network. So it's ideally like a really well-designed highway system. So the roads are ideally in good shape, not a lot of potholes. There's lots of lanes, so there's more than enough space for all the traffic to move efficiently. And overall, in this good, in a brain that develops like you want it to, we can get places pretty efficiently. Information can be processed pretty effectively. So on a brain level, this means that we can integrate information from multiple brain areas pretty quickly and accurately. So for example, if I show you this problem, 5 + 3, you can probably process that information pretty quickly, remember what adding means, what it means to add, and you can probably pretty quickly access that solution of 5 + 3 = 8. Imagine though that your highway system is disrupted, that those brain networks get disrupted. So the highway system, there's a lot of problems with the roads, there's a lot of construction, you're down to only one lane in each direction. So what happens in that case? What happens if the network is disrupted? So first of all, it's going to take a lot longer to get from A to B if you stick on your original road where all those things are shut down. Your brain may try to adapt and take a different route to get there, but you may end up at the wrong destination, or it may end up just taking quite a long time to get to the answer. So similarly, conditions like epilepsy or some of those factors that I'll talk about that are related to epilepsy can affect how your child's brain is structured. So if you have a child with epilepsy, they may find it harder to do some things, their thinking may be less efficient. And this can have This can manifest as, it may take them longer to process information, or they may need more repetition to learn something, they may be more easy, things like that. So going into specifically the cognitive skills that can be impacted by epilepsy. So we already talked about IQ, and again, IQ is a very broad general sense of cognitive functioning, but it doesn't give us a lot of information about different cognitive skills that I have listed here. And in fact, doesn't take several of them into account. So I did want to make sure to highlight these other cognitive areas that aren't really captured by IQ. So in addition to IQ, which again is normal in most people with epilepsy, but can be below the average range, and there's a higher risk for that, children with epilepsy are at risk for memory problems. What this may look like in their everyday life is they may have difficulty learning, remembering what was taught in school. They went to school that day, learned what a vocabulary word meant, could even repeat it back, seems like they knew it. They may lose it that next day if they have memory problems. They need that information repeated several times before they can hang on to it from day to day. They also may have some difficulty remembering conversations or other events that have happened. For children who have slowed processing speed as a result of their epilepsy, you may notice that they just need more time to do things. They need more time to do their homework. They need more time to think through problems, to think through answers. If you ask them a question, it may take them longer to process what you're saying and be able to give a response. And in general, they just may seem more sluggish relative to other kids their age. For children who have attention problems as a result of their epilepsy, you may notice that these children, even if they're trying hard to stay engaged in what's happening at school or what's happening at home, maybe looking at that worksheet or looking at the book they're trying to read, their attention may drift despite their best efforts. They, as a result, may have some difficulty remembering information. So that's an important thing to note, is that sometimes children who have attention problems, it may look more like memory problems, because if you're not paying attention to what's happening, there's no way that that information is going to get into your long-term memory for you to remember it if you were never paying attention to what was happening in the first place. So if you're noticing that your child is having a hard time learning and retaining information at school, it could be because of attention, it could be because of memory, or it could be because of both. And last but not least, children with epilepsy are at risk for difficulty with executive functioning. So executive functioning is this big category of cognitive skills, basically higher level cognitive skills that help you do more complex things. So, for example, executive functioning is being able to solve really complex problems, or being able to inhibit impulses to behave appropriately when you're at school and don't raise your hand and jump in the middle of what the teacher's saying. Executive functioning also encompasses things like organization and getting started on tasks and keeping on top of where you are and the completion of those tasks. So children who have difficulty with executive functioning may notice several things. One is they may have difficulty solving more complex problems. So if your child did really well with learning basic addition and subtraction in math class, they may suddenly start having more difficulty as those math problems get more complex, like with math word problems or with multi-step math problems like algebra. Your child may also have literal difficulty organizing their stuff. So their backpack may be a mess, their binder may just have all the papers they've gotten from all their classes all stitched together, or they may have problems organizing their approach to tasks in their head. So a lot of children with executive functioning weaknesses will be asked to write an essay and they might kind of freeze up because the process of writing, they may have really good ideas for what they want to put in the essay, but they might have a really hard time translating those ideas in an organized way into an essay. Children with executive functioning problems also may have difficulties getting started with tasks or keeping track of their schoolwork. So they may do assignments but forget to turn them in. They may know that the project is assigned, but not really plan it out very well. So they're doing most of it the night before it's due, things like that. And what's important to note about executive functioning is even if your child's seizures started when young, you may not notice difficulties with executive functioning, or it may not become problematic until they're older. Oftentimes, these problems really manifest when children go to middle or high school, because when kids are in elementary school, a lot of this stuff is taken care of for them. They don't have to solve very complex problems, and a lot of things are very structured and very organized for them when they're in elementary school. And as you get to middle school or high school, children are expected to do more independently, and they're not given as much support. For example, they're expected to just be able to know how to break down projects so they get it done on time without cramming the night before. So we often see executive functioning concerns really emerging around middle or high school, even if the seizures started much earlier than that. All right, so we've kind of covered the red flags. What are the common cognitive areas that are impacted or can be impacted in children with epilepsy? So now I'll talk about some of the big components that have an influence on that cognitive functioning in these children. And I'm just going to focus on these 5 today. So for starters, one thing to consider that can help us predict maybe what your child might be at risk for cognitively is the condition that causes the epilepsy. We don't always know what's causing the epilepsy, but seizures are generally a symptom of something that's wrong in the brain, right? So this could be due to several different factors. It could be related to a genetic condition, autoimmune condition, or structural factors like a traumatic brain injury or part of the brain just didn't develop the way that it was supposed to. So for example, here are examples of 2 children whose brains developed abnormally in some way. So in these cases, what we want to consider is how much brain developed abnormally, and that can give us a hint for what the level of cognitive impact a child can have. So over here on the left, the child has a genetic condition that led to one overly large hemisphere. So half of their brain at least did not develop today. So in children with this condition, they're at pretty high risk for overall cognitive impairment, so intellectual disability, in addition to high risk for seizures. On the right, what we see is a child with a much more focused brain abnormality. The brain abnormality is focused right here where the arrows are. And the abnormality itself likely wouldn't have much of an effect on their overall cognitive functioning. If it did, it would be subtle. So for this child, the cognitive effects really depend on their seizures. So how often are they having seizures and at what age did the seizures start? This is a big chart. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but what I wanted to highlight with this chart is the type of epilepsy syndrome that a child has also can provide some clues as to what we might expect cognitively for that child. And there's a big range. So for example, up here we see benign childhood epilepsy with centrotemporal spikes or BETs. And children with this condition often have pretty good cognitive outcomes. IQ is generally normal or maybe slightly below where you would expect it to be. But in general, cognitively, these children tend to do pretty well. This can range. Children with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome tend to have much more significant cognitive impact. So they're much more likely to have a severe intellectual disability. So again, knowing the epilepsy syndrome that the child has can give us some clues for what we might expect cognitively in the long term. Consider that is important is seizure frequency. So here I have a chart. This is just a research study that looked at the relationship between how often children have seizures and their IQ. And in general, and not surprisingly, what you see is that children who have a lot of seizures, who have seizures very frequently, have a much lower IQ than children who have a moderate or a low amount of seizures. So kids, the less often you have seizures, the higher your IQ is likely to be, which makes a lot of sense. And this just highlights, the importance of continuing to, give your child the recommended medication, consider the treatment options that your neurologist proposes, because we really do want to reduce the frequency of seizures as much as possible, even though that can be a very hard thing to do. Something else that's important to note too is, even if a child is not having obvious seizure activity, even if they're not actually having clinical seizures, sometimes they can still have abnormalities on EEG, so epileptiform discharges, that can still cause negative cognitive effects, even if they're not causing overt seizures. So the next thing I'll talk about is age of seizure onset. So there are certain time periods where foundations for certain skills are laid. And what I mean by that is, you can see in this first year of life, just as an example, is really important for laying the foundation for sensory skills like vision and hearing, as well as language skills. So if all goes well in that first year, you're laying a really nice concrete foundation for having good sensory pathways and good baseline language functioning. That foundation is solid, it's concrete. And then when your child grows up later and needs to develop higher level cognitive skills like executive functioning, they need to build upon these basic skills where that foundation will be really solid. Sometimes though, seizures can disrupt the development of those cognitive functions. So if there's a child that has a lot of seizures in that first year of life, right when language skills are coming online, the language foundation may be built a bit more rockily. It may be, instead of one solid slab of concrete, it may be several different smaller slabs that don't integrate well and are a little bit less steady, which makes it harder to build a solid house. It can affect the development of those later cognitive skills if those earlier skills are not built in a solid way. And sometimes, the effect of early seizures, you can see it pretty quickly, and other times, like I mentioned before, with executive function, you might not see the effects until much later. So it's important to keep in touch with your neurology team about how your child is doing cognitively, even if their seizures are pretty well controlled later on. Sometimes those things emerge later on. Next, we'll talk about medication. So I'm not going to go into great detail with this chart. You can see these are a lot of very more common anti-epileptic drugs. And just a summary as to whether each drug tends to lead to cognitive improvement, as indicated by the up arrow. No difference in cognitive functioning, as indicated by the side arrow, or if it negatively impacts cognitive functioning while the child is taking the medication, as indicated by the down arrow. So a lot of the medications listed here are cognitively benign or lead to some improvement in cognitive functioning, which is great. Medical practice has come a long way, where neurologists are often able to offer drugs that have minimal cognitive effect to kids to see if those control the seizures. But of course, sometimes those medications don't work or aren't appropriate for the child's seizure type, and it may be helpful to use the medications that do cause some level of cognitive impairment. So while the child is taking the medication, and you'll see the things that tend to be impacted in these drugs are things like attention. It's harder to pay attention, it's harder to remember information, and maybe harder to process language. So the purpose of this is, of course, we want to follow our neurologist's recommendation. Whatever medication helps control the seizures is probably a good idea for your child to be taking. But knowing what cognitive effects each medication can have is important for you to know, so you know what to expect if your child starts taking this medication, and you know what supports might be helpful for your child at home and at school if they're taking this medication. Last but not least, I'll talk about sleep. So all of us are probably aware that sleep can really impact cognitive functioning. So if you picture a day where you got very little sleep the night before, you were probably really groggy, slow to process information, and had a hard time paying attention, prone to making mistakes, things like that. So in everyone, sleep is really important for your cognitive functioning on a day-to-day basis. And the reason we bring it up in children with epilepsy is that sometimes kids with epilepsy have seizures overnight, or even those subclinical EEG discharges that don't cause overt seizures, but are still abnormalities on EEG, which can disrupt sleep. And something you'll notice if your child is having a lot of overnight seizures is you might notice memory problems in particular. And the reason for this is that sleep is critical for shifting information from kind of a shorter term, more tenuous memory store to a more solid, stable, long-term memory storage. It's what we call memory consolidation, happens overnight while you're sleeping. So if your child is having seizures overnight, you may notice some of those things I mentioned before related to memory. You notice that they're learning something in school one day, but not remembering it the next because those memories are not getting consolidated during sleep. So I talked a lot about things that lead to cognitive risk, things that might make cognitive functioning worse over time in children with epilepsy. So I wanted to take a second and talk a little bit about the things that can actually improve cognitive functioning. And one, of course, is getting good seizure control. We always want good control of these seizures because that'll just help your child in the long run. It'll help their brains develop along that more typical trajectory. And one way that people sometimes get good seizure control, if your child is a candidate for it, is epilepsy surgery. Now, I do want to highlight that every child has a different outcome from surgery. Some children do really well, some continue to have cognitive effects and may not see much improvement. On average, children who undergo surgery do have cognitive improvements in several areas, like it's easier for them to pay attention after surgery, they're better at processing language, they're better at processing visual spatial information, and all these things are really great. And are likely, because in an ideal scenario, what surgery does is it reduces how many seizures a child is having, and it reduces how many medications the child needs to take. So the combination of those two things can really help the child's cognitive development. Some skills tend not to be improved on average from surgery, including memory and overall IQ. Just to highlight that even if your child decide that they're going to have surgery, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to bounce back to what's normal for a child their age. There may still be some areas where they have difficulty after surgery. Things may improve, things may not improve very much, but the key is to just talk with your doctor, and if you're considering surgery, a neuropsychologist, to try to get a sense of what might the outcomes be for my child if they were to undergo surgery? Are there things that might get better? Are there things that might get worse? Are there things that might stay the same? But overall, on average, outcomes following surgery tend to be good cognitively. Consider too is that, kids as a full-time job go to school, and all these cognitive skills are really important for doing well in school. And what we know is that even children with epilepsy who have a normal IQ and seizures are well controlled are at risk for falling behind their peers academically. And this is just across the board in all subjects. So reading, math, and writing, they're at risk for having difficulties in these areas. It tends to have greater risk in older children, again, likely because things get more complicated, school gets harder as you get older, and the children are expected to be more independent, while kids with epilepsy are also at risk for having difficulty managing that independence because they're having difficulty with executive functioning and other skills like that. These kids also have greater risk for academic problems if they are identified as having problems paying attention. Cognitive skills also help support our ability to live or function independently. We call this adaptive functioning. And we know that children with epilepsy often have difficulty with adaptive functioning as well. So they may need more support in order to live independently than others their age, and they need more support in the job environment, for example. So in the brief time I have left, I wanted to review just where to go from here. So I talked about a lot of things. Some things may have resonated with you in your experience with your child, other things may not have. But if there are areas that you're concerned about and you haven't had a neuropsychological evaluation yet, that's something you can ask about. Ask your doctor if it's appropriate, because what they'll do is they'll assess all of these areas of cognitive functioning in your child and provide specific recommendations tailored to your child for what can help support them and help them be more successful in everyday life and in school. I also included some websites and resources for different school supports that can be helpful for children with epilepsy. This is information on 504 plans and IEPs in general, as well as some links for specifically resources if your child has undergone or will be undergoing epilepsy surgery. There's some tailored resources for those situations. And of course, if you're listening to this presentation, oh my gosh, yeah, my child does seem to have problems paying attention or remembering information, I wanted to include some resources for you, some strategies to try at home, some things just to try out if you think that would be helpful for each of these domains. PrognoUnderstood.org is a really great resource for a lot of cognitive strategies. That's it for my presentation today. Thanks so much for tuning in.